North Carolina's state budget picture is a little clearer today. Budget experts working for the governor and legislature have drafted their consensus revenue forecast. Joining us to make sense of the numbers is Joe Coletti, the John Locke Foundation's Senior Fellow for Fiscal Policy. Joe, we're going to get into some of the things that you pulled out of this consensus revenue forecast, but first, the headline number we've been hearing about is $4.1 billion. This seems to be money that is going to be coming in that was not expected just some months ago.
Right. Yeah, and the last forecast that was done back in May, that the Budget Office and the Fiscal Research Office for the General Assembly were looking at about $23.5 billion, and the current forecast is for $27.6 billion for the current year. So $4.1 billion more money coming in to the general fund than was expected. And there are a number of reasons for that, but that's the big news that is making pretty much everybody happy.
Yeah, that seems to be a big change. I mean, when you're talking $20+ billion and there's a difference of $4 billion, and it's to the good, right, not to the bad, not a $4 billion hole, that has to be, at least in some respects, good news.
It is good news for in a lot of ways. So for most people, it's good news because that is the biggest source of income for the state is the income tax, which means that we've all been earning more money. In addition to that, the state has been able to, and the earnings that we have are not just because business has been doing better than anybody expected back in May when all of this started, despite the shutdowns, despite everything that is going on, and also a portion of this is because the federal government was providing the unemployment checks to those without work. And had $600 a week for a period of time, that's all counted as income as well. And so that's been good. And sales taxes have not fallen off as much. So the state is in really good shape right now, about where we were before all of this started. And in addition to all of that is the delay of income tax recovery from April to July. Which created a $2 billion bonus. So all kinds of good things, which creates other problems when it comes to what are you going to do with the money?
Yeah, you have taken a look at this and come up with a early synopsis of your thoughts and recommendations. One of the first things I want to touch on is, even though we've mentioned $4.1 billion, you emphasize that it looks like there's going to be an unreserved fund balance of about $5 billion once you put everything in there. What does that mean for folks who don't understand or don't really follow what unreserved fund balance is? Is this $5 billion they have to play with in some respects?
For lack of a better term, yeah. What the fund balance is the money that the state has brought in that is not appropriated or otherwise targeted to be used in some way this year. And usually usually we look at it at the start of the year and at the end of the year. Start of the year to see what happened the year before and how much additional money on top of the revenue is available. And because there has been no budget agreement between the governor and the legislature for the last 2 years, the state came in with $1.5 billion. Those extra revenues that we talked about that exceeded expectations were higher than the revenue that were higher than the appropriations, and so that leaves $5 billion of basically one-time money. Right. This is you finished the year, you won, you had a windfall, something like that. You did better than you thought you were going to do. That doesn't mean that in the future you're going to continue that. And so when folks look at the budget, they look at this as one-time money to do with for an immediate need, and not as something to appropriate long-term.
Glad you mentioned that. You emphasize one-time money in your blog entry about this, and so that would mitigate against people who say, let's use this money for something that's going to be an ongoing expense. You actually spell out several things that the legislature could do with this money, treating it as one-time money.
Right. If you won the lottery, if somebody left you some money or you had a bonus, right? That's essentially what this is. And so your first thing that you want to do with it, what a lot of people have done with their stimulus checks, is to save it. And the state has $1.2 billion in savings in its rainy day fund to look at past experience with recessions and to deal with storms. The state should probably put another $2 billion into that. So that would be up to about $3.2 billion, and that would be a sizable amount that would get us through future recessions without having to rely on federal bailouts. Then a portion of that unreserved fund balance is by law supposed to go into the state capital and infrastructure fund, which pays for the debt service that the state owes on bonds that it's taken out in the past, and a portion of that is then available to use for new capital projects. And so $1.25 billion, if we end up with $5 billion, 1.25 of that would go into there. Place that we really should put money and haven't put as much as we should, as would be good, is pensions and healthcare for retired state employees. You'd still end up with some money left over if we hit that $5 billion mark, and so suggest that we should return some of that to taxpayers as well.
Yeah, you suggest that perhaps a one-time tax refund of up to $120 per tax filer. Now, what about the recurring revenue? Because we talked about the fact that this big cushion really seems to be just available once, right. But there is a story to be told from these numbers about what to do on recurring spending.
Right. So the 27.6 is a huge number and well above what was expected. But looking at the next 2 years, the biennium that the General Assembly and the governor will actually be budgeting for, we'll see if they come to an agreement. But there's $27.3 billion available in the first year of the biennium, so the year that starts on July 1st. And we do a biennium, so the second year they're looking at $28 billion of revenue, and that is over and that's more than we use population and inflation as our gauge for what is a reasonable amount of spending, so that the adjusted for inflation, the money that each person is spending on state government doesn't increase from year to year, and there's a $27 billion. That $27 billion is about $1 billion more than what we look at as a reasonable amount to be spent. So there's room there for more money to go into capital as well, and to cover those recurring expenses that will come up, and the state can address even with the last 2 years of flat spending.
In fact, you say that there would be some money available to help with students and their learning deficits, strengthening public health infrastructure, and meeting some other demands. So it's not as if you could spend like a drunken sailor, but there is some money available to meet these needs. Right,
and that becomes really important because at the federal level, they're still looking at how do you send more money down to the states, and part of the forecast that that is looking at the revenues here is based on an assumption that the federal government is going to send money down. Not necessarily, this doesn't include money that goes to the state directly, but the money that you and I and the rest of our listeners would be receiving, and that and is strengthening businesses and strengthening personal incomes. And if that comes through, then there's less need for for the state itself to receive money from the federal government, because we can cover those needs that are essential, that are pandemic related and otherwise, and continue the business of government, improve the business, and deal with what this pandemic over the last year has highlighted as needs for schools, for public health, and for other areas.
I want to mention one more thing, and that is you have said ever since the budget issues have been discussed linked to the pandemic that the General Assembly, Governor's office, anyone who's involved in the budget should be taking a cautious approach because we didn't really know what the numbers were going to tell us. Now we know a little bit more, and some people might say, oh, it's time to turn on the spigot, let's spend a little bit more because we know we have more of a cushion. You're still urging caution.
Right. And yeah, these numbers are great, but there is one of the biggest assumptions in the numbers that the state budget office mentioned is that we're going to be all of this is going to be behind us by July 2022.
The pandemic.
Yeah, the pandemic and all the related things that go with that. But even with the vaccines, there are people who are still uncomfortable to go out in public, to go to restaurants, to not wear masks. And we have advice from some that we should wear 2 masks, right? So all of those things and the discomfort that will be long lasting. And so to be able to say that everything's going to be back to normal in a little over a year, is a large assumption. And as much as everybody hopes that things are back and that students are in the classroom in the fall, hard to say that that's going to happen. And so how many people are going to be able to get back to work? How many people, what kind of work are they going to be going back to? All of these are still big uncertainties that are weighing on us. And in addition to the amount of borrowing that the federal government has done and what that could mean for inflation and for debt and for just the general economic challenges that the rest of us face. So all of that leads to, these are great numbers, and it's good to be able to say that there's room to accomplish things, but we should still be very cautious, and it's better to have some room to do those things instead of trying to, in the middle of the year, look at what was promised and say we can't do all of that.
As the budget process moves forward, we know that one person who's going to continue crunching the numbers and giving us expert analysis of them is Joe Coletti. He is a senior fellow at the John Locke Foundation. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mitch.